back to Life Elsewhere.
Pleasure being here, Norman, as always.
Now, I moments before you come on here with me on Zoom, and I see you've got a new post up today on Counterpunch, the title being Locking Up Felines Cat Curfews Down Under. I've got to ask you, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but what's going on with the little cats down under?
Well, there's for some of your listeners who might be familiar, the cats, the domestic cat is an introduced species in Australia, and unfortunately, Australian wildlife has not developed over the years and did not develop, as it were, resistance or and a means of coping with such a versatile, ruthless predator. And as a result of that, we've got essentially two categories of cats that come up for debate in Australia. One is the so-called the house cat, domesticated cat, and then there are the feral cats. And the feral cat population is very devastating, but the domestic cat population is also very devastating. And studies have been done recently, by the Biodiversity Council here, suggesting the sheer extraordinary damage that each domestic cat does. And of course, owners are none the wiser. They don't always observe what their cats are doing, and they have this kind of idealized version about,
Well, yes, yeah.
Tobermory's behaving himself in the back or whatever it is. But this debate about curfews has been ongoing for a long time, and so what's happening in Australia is that many town councils or city councils, because that's more city council affair, the regulation of animals in backyards and so on. So there are these regulations that have been imposed depending on which city council it is about whether it's a curfew, whether it should be 24 hours, whether it's just a night curfew. And of course, I'm just imagining what the cats think about all of this, how bemused they must be. Yeah, so the article is somewhat satirical and somewhat pointing fun at these efforts to treat cats essentially, to anthropomorphize cats, which is something humans like to do all the time.
Of
Of course,
course, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well, I love the fact that you're doing something a little lighter. I guess for some people it's deadly serious. When you talk about cats, you have to be deadly serious around some folk. But
No,
so
certainly.
thank you for writing this. I should add that I have mentioned him on the program a number of times. Some of my attentive listeners will know that I have a feral cat. When I say I have a feral cat, there is a feral cat which I've aptly named Little Thug, who's cute as a button but very demanding. And I've gotten into the habit of feeding the little blighter, which of course I'm told is the worst thing I can possibly do. But Little Thug gets fed quite regularly, and I guess I've sort of adopted him, I guess. So yes. All right. Let's get on with some topics that I want to ask you about, Mr. Benoit. First one, and I titled this Posturing in the Free World, or The Never-Ending Antics of Mr. Trump. I guess I'm going to subhead this by saying, well, it just doesn't stop. Every day there's something else. There's another thing, and there's another thing, and there's another thing. But what I want to ask you, Benoit, is that we've talked non-stop in some respects about Mr. Trump over the last, what, 10 years or so, maybe more. Can you see at some point an ending? And I don't mean by his death, I mean just the ongoing antics, the posturing in the free world, if you like, of this man. Can there be an end?
Well, he is certainly a one-off character insofar as that his tenure will come to an end one way or the other. It will, he of course the mutterings now about him trying to see if he can exploit a loophole, perceived loophole about running for a third term, which is something that would require, I think, very adventurous interpretive skills and a lot of course, potential revolution, so to
Yes,
speak.
yeah, yeah.
So let's not discount that. But I would say, though, that in terms of his, there will be a point where he will have to sort of pass from politics and so on. But his legacy, though, will remain. And I think this is the thing. It's not going to go away because what he's
Right.
done is, and I think in a couple of key respects, one is the way, of course, he conducts diplomacy, which is quite sort of remarkable in the sense that, nothing is sacred. There are no sacred cows. in the context of alliances or in the context of adversaries. One never knows if you're going to be treated better as an adversary, let alone being treated better as an ally.
Yes.
Just as we, speaking now, over the last 24 hours, he's been belittling one of the US's closest allies, South Korea, for
Yes.
not seemingly wanting to participate in denuclearization talks regarding Iran. And in the same breath, praising the North Korean regime for supposedly being strong, reliable, and stable, and so on. It's quite remarkable, this sort of thing. So, um, so diplomacy is one aspect, and the other aspect, too, of course, is the domestic front, where he has created a system of politics that will be very problematic to impeach, to actually change, because his interpretation of the executive power is a very broad and controlling one, and his personalization of politics and personalization of the civil service and the public service generally, I think, is going to have a very crippling effect, broadly speaking. So I don't, if it is a Democrat who wins the next, is the next occupant in the White House, that particular individual is going to find it very difficult not to adopt similar policies, not to adopt a broad interpretation about the control of the various arms of government. And I think that's something that we're going to have to see. But I'm not optimistic about the fact that this is going to stop with Trump's departure. I think he has left an indelible mark, I'm sure.
Okay, so from leading on from that very nicely, we can segue in to the midterms that are looming here in the US of A. But I've got a question. Are the Democrats really ready?
Yes, that's a very good question as to their readiness. There's certainly a lot of ferment and excitement taking place in certain ranks of the Democrats insofar. Well, I mean, we've got the background, obviously, with Trump's popularity, diminishing popularity with the Iran war. That's been particularly the effect of prices at home and gasoline and so on. And then there've also been, in addition to that, the prospect that the emergence of democratic socialism and so on, the Mamdani model, if you like, of individuals who've been making inroads against centrist Democrats in various primaries and so forth. That's been particularly interesting. But the question is whether that translates into a broader national trend, because
Yes.
the Democrats are going to face a problem, I think, in translating that appeal into a broader sense. Say, for example, in Michigan, where we've got Abdul El Said's victory, which was it should be said he was actually leading against the centrist Democrat there for quite some time, and it was clipped back in the actual primary. So he did win, to much acclaim, but at the same time, I think the problem with the Democrats is they have to try to find a way of making certain platforms cutting through the Trump noise and making platforms such as, more affordable healthcare, seemingly less communist, as Trump likes to call it, and so and socialist, and raising in tax and things like that. These are very unpopular measures, so they will have to find some way of also, and I think this has been one of the big problems with the Democrats. They need to find a way of transcending their identity politics, which is a very big thing of their agenda, because identity politics has been a big problem there. The Trump has been very active on attacking the Democrats for their diversity platform, for their supposed woke platform, and things like that. And I've written about this in the past about the fact that Trump's victory, for example, against against the Democrats in the last election was premised largely because of the localizing of issues regarding things such as living standards, regarding things such as what's left, in your pocket after you finish your grocery shopping and things like that. Of course, a lot of that has gone to shot, and popped, with what's happened, with the Iran war and these sorts of things. But it's very notable that ultimately, the food on the table argument and living standards, these are the kinds of things the Democrats should try to return to, rather than promoting the kind of left identity brand that one associates with a more privileged type of politics.
Do you see, Binoy, a viable candidate for the Democrats waiting in the wings for the general election in 2028?
To be honest with you, I'm not sure. I know that, of course, a few have put their hands up, and News from California as an example. But I he looks like more of the same.
Yes.
He very much is part of the machine politics. He's very much part of the you know the strange kind of skin many American politicians tend to seem to have when they're running for office, or which is to say that they, like Trump, they seem to be stuck in some very strategically placed solarium where they they get a particular tan, which is remarkably odd, and they also have a particular type of dye for their hair, which I find remarkable. But it's that kind of strange falsity and so on that that many of these figures have that I just find this very hard to translate into appeal. Of course, having said that, it'll be interesting to see what the Republicans come up with, because that's
Yes.
another thing.
Yes.
Whether they do, whether it is going to be, for example, JD Vance, or whether it's going to be someone like Rubio, for example. So that will be
Well,
interesting.
let's get into that just briefly because I want to go back to the Democrats in a moment, but just let's get into a Republican candidate. First of all, my big question would be, can Trump will his ego let somebody else run for president? And is he going to
Mm.
endorse somebody and then at the last minute trash them? Because, or is he going to try and remain sort of in situ in Mar-a-Lago as a sort of a sort of in hiding president? I mean, I'm not sure exactly. How do you see that working out, Benoit?
Yes, no, I think it's very much a risk here that he will be, as with other leaders, very reluctant to relinquish power. He's going to be the hand behind the throne.
Yes.
And if you are going to be the hand behind the throne, one way of doing so, and history has numerous examples of this, the person who's appointed initially, at least, or given favor, is probably going to be the one, as you say, he's going to trash. And then he will shift his allegiance to someone else he might see more amenable to his particular control. So yes, I do see him as a person who's going to try to do as much as he can to be the puppeteer in the background as much as things will allow. And the real risk, you can already see that about the way he's playing favors between Rubio and Vance,
Yes.
and see that he's shifting this kind of tone between those two men as a case in point. So if I was in either man's position, I'd be concerned about how damaging that initial favor might be, because it may actually shift later on, depending on the circumstances, obviously.
Would the wanton ego and the sort of lust for power for both those men override any sense of, well, I guess sense?
Yes, I certainly think so. I think the problem is this is a very egomanic administration. It's filled with egos, and
Yeah.
that's the nature of it. It's with Trump being, of course, the supreme ego of all. And the reality is that with that kind of climate at that place, so that kind of race, we are going to expect a lot of that. And I do see it getting actually rather nasty. And I do see the prospect that because it's so combative, and because Trump has created this atmosphere, this somewhat poisonous, viper-like atmosphere, I do see that things could get rather messy.
Do you think the midterms will give us a clue what we can look forward to in the general in 2028?
Yes, I think there'll be some clue about that, because we still see the Trump mark being so dominant in terms of Trump endorsed candidates, for example,
Yeah.
Trump backed candidates. The MAGA movement is still strong. There is still momentum there. It remains to be seen whether the Democrats can net both houses. Of course, I know Nat Silver has been doing some polling, and he tends to be fairly good on his figures, and he's suggesting with this latest number crunching that the Democrats should win both houses. But I'm not necessarily sure about that.
Yes, yes.
I do think that there is still this prospect. Remember, the Republicans have been very busy gerrymandering districts and so
Right.
on, and that will be an additional hurdle that the Democrats will have to combat, in addition to their own problems as to whether be it the Democratic Socialists or be it more left-wing candidates manage to get across the line. That's another thing that we'll also have to consider.
Excellent point, Benoit. Let's now just go back to the Democrats for a moment. And I just want to throw out a name and get your reaction. Ossoff.
Well, yes, I mean the thing. You see, what is interesting about these kind of situations, and I think more broadly speaking, I'm still yet to commit about whether the significance of this. I do have to say that the problem I see with the Democrats here is, again, back to what I've said to you before, is that I don't tend to think they're very plausible at the end. so
Yeah.
so unfortunately, there is still something hollow in the nature of these things. I feel, but nonetheless, look. As you know, I'm reluctant to gaze into the crystal ball on these things, but I think there is some room for maneuverability there, and so we'll have to see what happens in that score.
Yes. Okay. Medical alerts. What happens if another pandemic arrives? Can RFK do the right thing? You mentioned healthcare. This ties in with your mention of healthcare. So, what do you think about that? Can RFK do the right thing if a pandemic arrives?
Ah, yes. Well, let's start off with what he has done, which suggests that readiness and preparedness may not quite be top of the list here for any pandemic that hits US shores. First of all, you just need to see what has happened in terms of the funding cuts and the staff cuts in across the Health and Human Services Department. Now, remember that it is a hulking organization; it's huge, of course.
Hmm.
The Health department and services department is enormous. But the reduction of staff as specialist staff and the replacement of specialist staff, for example, with personal appointees, especially regarding Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s own circle, I think is very problematic because what he's done is purposely remove in his inner circle specialists and advisors, let's call them the eggheads. And he's shown a particular withering contempt for those people and he's decided to handpick individuals to run, departments in acting capacities as well. So one of the disturbing things, if you start looking at the National Institute of Health and the various institutes within it or under its control, almost half of them seem to have acting heads. They're not actual permanent heads. And that in itself is not a good state of affairs. Given the fact also that the US has indicated its contempt for international pandemic regulation by withdrawing from the World Health Organization, in a very very publicly making that sort of move, there is a certain suggestion that this is not as serious, at least at the top level, as one might hope it should be. The attitudes to the Hunter virus as well and to the Ebola outbreak and so on by Kennedy himself have been a bit strange because he seems quite distant about his statements on this, and he tends to sort of offload a lot of these burdens to subordinates to actually do that work for him. So he's very much out of the picture regarding these things. He seems to be obsessed, it would seem, at the moment with food standards and so on, which is not a bad thing. Of course, diet is something that's highly problematic in the United States, and improved diet is certainly something we can we can champion. But when it comes to preparedness and so on, given the fact that he's reduced staff at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, given the fact that there are so many acting staff and so on, and of course, given and let's not forget his innate and continuing hostility to vaccination programs and vaccines, full stop, suggests that there is going to be a real uphill battle, not just when the next pandemic transpires, but the collaborative, cooperative response to it, because there'll be many people suspicious about, of course, what happened during COVID, about misinformation, about what is true, what isn't true, about the fact that someone like Kennedy is a skeptic, and of course, instances such as, well, the recent very public discussion about the inconsistencies of Anthony Fauci's remarks on one hand and his notebooks and what supposedly he told the public. So none of this actually helps the state of preparedness in the US context regarding the next pandemic.
Well, I'm so glad, and thank you for that. I'm so glad that you just mentioned Dr. Anthony Fauci, because obviously there was what seems nothing more than a charade last week, calling Fauci before Rand Paul to be, I don't even know what you call it, castigated in a kind of performance art way. Just give me a quick take on that little scenario.
Yes, I mean that's exactly it. Castigated is one way. I would have said, tarred and feathered. It just
Yes.
seemed that Fauci was being given the treatment of which, and I'm not saying that by any means, and I've been critical of Fauci in the past about certainly his mixed messages, and it was certainly evident during his time um, at the Disease and Control Center that he did. And to be honest, he was with along with many health officials of the world. He didn't quite know what he was dealing with. I mean, people
Yes.
didn't really know what they were dealing with regarding the transmissibility of COVID, about of the SARS virus, this new novel SARS virus, how rapidly it would spread, what would be the best way of combating it, and so on. And I know, of course, from my personal perspective, I could see how confused and how utterly unaware it seemed that officials were, say, in the state of Victoria, which had some of the toughest lockdown laws in response to COVID transmission in the world.
Yes.
Melbourne was one of the cities with the most days of lockdown in the world. I think the only other city with comparatively might have been Buenos Aires, but the reality was that here it was particularly savage, and the messaging and the information from the government kept changing. And of course, in many ways, you had to understand it would have to change because they themselves were not sure
Right. Right.
about what was developing. And that's the problem with pandemic planning. Usually, what you tend to see is that the pandemic response is patterned on the previous response. It's like fighting battles and conflict. The generals are preparing for the last war rather than the war to come,
Yes.
and that's the problem with pandemic planning, generally speaking. So I have a lot of sympathy for Fauci, but I do also think that he has a share of responsibility for the skepticism and the lack of trust, I think, that Americans tend to have in their public health communications, if you like, when it comes to these matters.
Benoit, I guess. Okay, here's something I want to talk about. I, as you know, had an extended trip to the UK, to my home country, a month or so ago. And the big news story there was the heat and what was going on in America. Everybody was asking me this. Whilst that was happening, a new PM was being introduced. So here we have a new PM in the UK, not just in America, but does anybody in the UK really care? Is it really news considering there's been how many PMs in the last couple of years?
Yes, and you raise a very important point, which is to say, and this issue of should we care or not is an interesting one because the the political classes and the chatting classes, when it comes to politics, of course, will find it interesting and find it fascinating that Burnham has come to power. First of all, let's remember the context. He came to power because the incumbent or the Sir Keir Starmer had demonstrated woefully that he could not essentially run the country and he could not be the prime minister, despite having an absolutely astonishing, formidable majority that he won at the last
Yes.
national elections. And it takes a lot of, I think it takes a lot of talent to squander popularity in that spectacular fashion that he did. Suddenly people were realizing that, well, he did not communicate so well. And suddenly people realized that he couldn't, that he was, as it were, not able to implement his policies in the way that he wanted to. He came across as distant, he came across as ineffective, and he came across as petty. And all of these things combined to strike fear into the hearts of members of his party that maybe he was not the man to lead the Labour Party to the next election. And hence we saw the appearance of Andy Burnham, the so-called King of the North, the grand,
King of the
the
North.
essentially
I
the head mayor.
love it. King of the
Yeah,
North. I love it. Yes, go on. Carry on.
yeah, yeah, and of course, the individual, mayor of Manchester, the great area of Manchester, and seen as very much, the counter to Starmer in terms of his communication, in terms of his accessibility, and I think more importantly, Burnham, does seem to show, well, he doesn't come across as having the same scandal sheet, for example, and at the same degree of ineptitude as Starmer does, because Starmer, let's not forget, made the appalling decision to essentially give his approval to, the appointment of Peter Mandelson in the context there. for the Washington's to the ambassadorship to Washington, and that was an absolute disaster, given, of course, Mandelson's connections with Jeffrey Epstein. And so these were just further things that demonstrated that Starmer was not appropriate. But in terms of Burnham, in terms of what he does, it all depends on whether he has an actual policy that he will implement. And I think one of the things that I see that's very promising about Burnham is that he is trying to focus on localizing governing activities. So, for example, the idea of the Manchester model being translated into the broader national model is something that we will be looking at, and I will certainly look at with interest. So one of the things he's suggesting is that more income should be distributed to the mayors of Britain, and that will be a revolutionary move because it's very London centric, as you know.
Yes. So I understand, Benoit, that Burnham wants to open a Downing Street of the North in Manchester.
Yes, so what is fascinating about this approach is that Burnham is tackling something that others have flirted with over the years, but never quite achieved fully, and that is an attempt to deregulate or rather localize a lot of the central functioning of government from London and actually transfer it to some regional areas. And of course, he's very sympathetic to Manchester as a very important city in the north. And his idea is to actually shift more governing functions to that particular part of Britain, and to divert resources, as it were, into local government in that way. So that's quite remarkable. And in that sense, if he pulls this off, this will be a remarkable change. And it's certainly going to be very popular in dealing with that divide between North and South. And there is, of course, you can also see the division manifest in the context of voting, say, for Brexit or,
Yes.
voting for these other
So
particular. And I
important.
think
Yes. Yeah.
yes, and his effort to deal with this alienation, if you like, this perception of the smaller city centres being distant from London is a very important one, away from the metropolis. So he's also suggested to, yes, his suggestion, mind you, these are just suggestions at this point of redistribution of income, more income, as it were, to regional mayors is certainly something that's going to be remarkable. And it's very popular. It will be very popular with a lot of officials in that field. The question is, though, and this is the big question: the tyranny of the Treasury, and whether the conservatism and the fiscal conservatism of the Treasury prevails, or whether Burnham manages to combat it. Because that, I know people will say, well, he is the prime minister, surely that shouldn't be a problem. But the reality of it is that Starmer has been deeply frustrated, or was frustrated, with a lot of his policies regarding the close tight knit that was held, as it were, Treasury and the purse strings. So, and there are other policies too that will appeal. His cap on bus fares, for example, he's going to put a cap, reduce it from £3 to £2. That's another aspect of it. And he's also going to do something that will also be appealing and is very much against the trend, and not just the Conservatives, but with Labour over the last 30 to 40 years, which is to institute a massive council house building program.
Yes.
And in that sense, what is really interesting is that he's now returning back to those traditional roots where, his idea is to wrest control from the market, if you like, from the private sector of certain functions, be it in housing, be it in public transport, combating neoliberalism, if you like, that has been such the rage. And his idea is to actually put more services in government control and invest in public services in a bigger way than before. And in this sense, it'll be very interesting to see what the response will be to this particular, announcements.
Benoit, traveling around for over a month in the UK, one of the big standouts for me, big takeaway, was when I traveled to other parts of the UK, up north, west, south. It was the us and them feeling. And it's always been like that to some
Mhm.
degree, that, London is them and we're us. If you live in Yorkshire or Manchester or Liverpool or even in Bristol on the in the West Country. There's always been this us and them situation. Another thing
Mm.
that came to my mind as I was over in the UK and listening to Burnham and listening to talks about Burnham was, and I'm completely wrong about this because I was reasonably young at the time, but it reminds me of the late Harold Wilson. Am I am I correct in sort of making some kind of connection there?
No, I don't think so. I think it's something to keep in mind when Harold Wilson, uh, he was, until Blair, certainly the most successful Labour leader.
Yeah.
He had also that communicative appeal and that sense of it. And there was the element of the modernizing about him, of course. There was, and
Yeah.
that's something that he certainly played on. He had a certain appeal, a certain manner about him, but he was also very much popular with technology, the white heat of technology and change
Yes.
and so forth.
Yes.
That was,
Yes.
of course, advanced by Tony Benn, who was the technology minister then, and so forth. But there are elements of that. But of course, we have to try to resist the temptation of getting too carried away, I think, because it's still very early days.
Right. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And we have to realize that, and it's still very quiet. Remember, it's the summer period here at this particular point where Parliament doesn't sit, and in a sense, he's been very fortunate to have this very long stretch until the next sitting in the Commons, where he will then be tested, and then we'll see what happens. But he has a lot of time to bed down, as it were, the bed of roses, so to speak, as he settles in. And also, he's been fortunate in the meantime that a rather embarrassing circus, unfolded in Clacton, in
Oh,
the Essex seat of Clacton,
yes.
with, of course,
Yes.
the re-election. Yes, he was re-elected, but Nigel
Nigel
Farage,
Farage. Yeah.
the Reform UK leader, decided to demonstrate, to take his credentials to the good burghers of Clacton by, saying that, well, he was being unduly hounded for not registering his interests in terms of money he'd received from Christopher Harborne, a billionaire based in Thailand. It's good to be a patriot when you're in Thailand, isn't it?
Of course.
And receiving money that and not actually declaring it on the members' interests, and instead of actually going with the investigation, of course, Farage decided to resign and then essentially trigger by-election, which he did win, but he only won it against candidates, none from the major parties, but most prominently the second place candidate with, I think, 26% of the vote, almost 27% of the vote, was an intergalactic space warrior
Yes.
with a bin on his head.
And they
Yeah,
had two members of the raving loony party or something like that. There was also
absolutely. The wonderful tradition of British democracy.
exactly talking about British democracy and the media. And I want to bring the US back into this because one of the things that I noticed firsthand when I was over in the UK, and that was the difference how politics is handled by the media and media's approach to politics and politicians in the UK as the same how it happens over it's not the same how it happens over here in the US completely different. Over here is a sort of almost like a genteel approach. There's a kind of should I ask this question or not, whereas in the UK there's this almost kind of antagonistic right from the get-go, from the commentators, from the news people. Can you give me any
Mm.
insight into that? Do you see the same thing, or am I is that maybe my imagination, Benoit?
No, I think it goes back, I think, to that great British tradition of remorselessly satirizing and lampooning and being critical of politicians.
Yes.
And of course, to me, none better reflected than the great tradition of Private Eye,
Private Eye, of
that
course.
great
Yeah, yeah,
satirical
yeah,
magazine.
yeah.
And where there is, and people who do visit the UK from other countries, including the United States, are very taken aback by how ruthless, as it were, the press can be about British politicians, how cynical almost they are about
Yes.
British politicians, and and the fact of how Starmer was treated is a case in point. The fact it was very much down to a remorseless assault and Stam on a weekly basis across the various publications.
Yes.
Even supposedly sympathetic ones like The Guardian and so on, that are more sympathetic to Labour, for example. They were very skeptical about his particular rule and about his inability to get his message across. And this this mocking of politicians is simply something that's not done in other countries, and it would be inconceivable, for example, to have the kind of parodies that you see in that same way. Even though in the US it's true, there are parodies, and there are, a lot of it is designed. A lot of the criticism and the targeting doesn't happen in the press in the US. It happens in the late night talk show circuit, I've noticed. That
Yes.
is where most of the commentary is conducted, and that is where
Yes.
most of the opinions, if you like, are aired. It's the whole late night talk show circuit. It's
It's
not
not in,
actually in the
yeah,
presses per se, but it is in that circuit. That's what I find rather interesting in the
yes.
US by way of comparison.
It's not in primetime TV or
No,
radio.
it's not. It never is in prime time. And if anything, there's a kind of an almost sickening accommodation in the presses uh, about the various political figures. There is so much to satirize in the US. There's so much that one can write about the way the political figures behave, but there just isn't. There is a sense that the fourth estate essentially is fairly moribund in the US, I feel. I feel that, for example, the not being critical, and a lot of it is also based on the amount of money in the system. Journalism is not critical enough, for example, about the amount of money that's spent. I mean, just take, for example, the primaries recently. With the context of how much is spent, where a Democratic primary candidate will have $32 million, in terms of their war chest to fund, and that'll be from APAC and these particular bodies. It's extraordinary to think
Yes.
about that. Whereas in Britain, people get I don't want to say hysterical, but they get concerned if the donation is not registered over £300.
Right. Which is why the Farage thing was so important, wasn't it?
Exactly,
And
and that's
how
why
he
I
dealt
think
with that.
many
Yeah.
American politicians would be very bemused by this. They'd be
Yeah.
bemused, my God, it's just £5 million. What's
Yeah.
that about?
What's that about? Yeah. Yeah. So fascinating. I mean, we always manage to it's talking to you is just wonderful. I love your input. I want to just touch on one last topic, and this is based upon a gentleman I had on the show a couple of days ago. We haven't aired the conversation yet, but another gentleman that writes for Counterpunch, a gentleman out of California, Robert Hunziker. He writes about ecosystems and the danger we're in. And I wondered if ecosystem now is the new way we reference climate change. And I wanted to get your take on that.
Well, there's no question that the ecosystem is dovetails into obviously the climate change debate, because you just have to see, to take as an example, the Australian habitat or the Australian ecosystem being very fragile as it is, and a nice way of uh, you know referring back to our opening when we were discussing about feline control or cat curfews and
Yes. Yeah.
control. But in Australia, there's something that even adds to that, which is the effects of climate change, and ecosystem is very much a big thing. And in fact, in Australia, just to give you an example, since 2000, the figures that were released in 2025 suggested that 2,179 species, and that's just off the top of my head, uh, are now considered at risk in the Australian ecosystem. And that is a phenomenal number. That's an increase of over 50% from 2000 to 2025. And that just gives you an idea about how much in danger the systems are, and that there is a fear that, for example, the entire marine system, connected with the Barrier Reef, which is the largest, one of the largest marine systems on the planet, it's suffering repeated bleaching moments, where corals are bleached and so on, which is frightfully damaging for them. Some bleaching can be permitted, but when that happens at a certain rate, the corals cannot regenerate. And that has, of course, the the corals are themselves central to the ecosystem of the fish and other wild marine life that exists there. So you kill off one group, then you end up killing off the rest of them, and that is where we start talking about such doomsday things as ecosystem collapse and so forth, and that's something that's very serious. So when you consider, for example, that, and I don't want to be a doomsday about this, but it is very important to appreciate that the conversations about climate change and how they link to the ecosystems, we still see the tardiness in Europe about approaching renewables. We still see, for goodness sake, a suggestion that there should be more nuclear, or there should be, a North Sea oil should be pursued. Not there should be more drilling, as it were, rather than less drilling.
Right, right.
We see that in Australia, that we see coal-powered companies and coal-powered plants being prolonged in their lives. So for all the talk about combating climate change, there is still a deep entrenched approach to a conservatism about trying to deal with the fossil fuel industries and so on that still maintain a huge control over the various policy making groups, be it in the United States, be it in Canada, be it even in Europe, and certainly in Australia.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. I'm once again don't want to keep on repeating myself, but it is an absolute pleasure chatting with you and getting your opinion. We've covered an awful lot of subjects here, Benoy, and I just want to throw this out to you just before we wrap. Is there anything going on right now? And of course, there's lots and lots of things, but is there something that strikes Benoy Kampmark as being so worthy of reporting and talking about and discussing that it drives you insane that it isn't to the fore?
Well, I suppose it's not so much that it's not reported, but I suppose it's interesting. It's the way things are reported, and that is the way, for example, and this goes back down to the orange-haired ogre in the White House, and that is largely the fact that the media cycle is now so dominated by him that journalists are not really doing journalism anymore, and the reporting is based primarily on what he says on Truth Social. And in fact, what has happened is this strange phenomenon, and we saw this with his attempt now to hive off Truth Social as a possible money-making venture,
Right.
so that you can get advanced access to his messages, and that will be a way of controlling the narrative in the press. And I just find that extraordinary. I mean, that is extraordinary, and not more of an outrage is being registered by that. I mean, there are ethical issues about it. There will be some. I think there is an idea being floated of trying to legally challenge it, but I just find that extraordinary. It's because what has happened is that, and to a large extent, the media, they're the victims of their own
Making.
reporting in a
Yeah,
sense, because
yeah,
what they've done is,
yeah.
they rely on press releases. And I try to always tell my students, when it comes to the press release serves two functions. One is to protect the writer of the release and anybody who's covered in it in terms of not revealing too much. And the second thing is, the important thing about a press release is what it doesn't mention. And the problem with the way we're seeing things done now, when it comes to reporting about someone as significant as the President of the United States, is that we look at his messages on Truth Social as if it were true. Of
Yeah.
course, we always have to assume that Truth Social is itself a contradiction in terms. It's neither social nor truthful.
Well, I've got you. Quick one. I want your opinion on this because I've been getting some very interesting responses from some of my friends in the media and outside of the media. Regime Change from Haberman and Swan. Have you read it? Are you going to read it? Can you give me an input about it?
Yes, I managed to get a bootlegged copy, so I
Yes,
managed to get
me
that
too.
recently.
Yes,
Yes, that's
yes,
right.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Yes. So, well, I think that is interesting because it's one of the It's very interesting from that perspective because what is fascinating about it is that I mean, Trump, of course, has dismissed it as a pack of lies,
Of
but
course.
that really doesn't matter because nothing he says is particularly truthful anyway. So that
Yeah.
doesn't matter. It's neither here nor there. What I find interesting is that many of Trump's officials and aides and those in his inner circle, what is fascinating is how few of them have actually contested the claims of that book, Regime
Right.
Change. And
Yes.
in fact, it just demonstrates the to me one the level of depth that the journalists went through. One of them, incidentally, Jonathan Swan, his father is a health journalist, actually also a GP, a qualified GP who works in Australia's Radio National.
Ah,
So
okay.
yes, so Jonathan's father is actually working for the ABC in Australia. So that's quite interesting. But Jonathan's been particularly good about this with his of course, author, the New York Times. And what they've done is, I think it must have been exhausting for them because of the number of interviews they did and having to discard some information just because they didn't have enough. I mean, they had enough, but they didn't have what they thought was enough to confirm what happened in the White House. And I think they've been very diligent about the way they do that. So I'm looking forward to actually reading it and writing an overview, a critique of it, and see what happens there.
A good friend of mine, whose name I won't mention, but happens to be a fairly well-known commentator, his appraisal is that why didn't Haberman and Swan talk about these things whilst they were happening? Why did they keep it all under lock in their diaries? Because to make a book that would sell, he is very critical of the delay tactics.
I look, I can see that, but I have another. I would have another interpretation
Yeah,
of that,
sure.
and that goes down to their method, because things happen too quickly in journalism. So if you want a record that stands the test of time, you know the expression that journalism is the first draft of history. But if you wanted to test make it last, so to speak, it's one thing to write about, and someone like Trump, it changes within 24 hours, maybe 12 hours. So does it really make sense to release something that you thought you had a conversation, which you have to then verify with others in terms of whether this has happened or not, with 4 or 5 different people, and then you try to publicize it, by which time the material would have changed, would have already gone cold because this is the Trump administration. I don't know whether it serves that purpose rather than accumulating a body of evidence and then putting it together into a book where you can then see the patterns in terms of what's happening. So I actually think that I do understand the criticism and I do understand why. I think a lot of it is also because journalists would also be a bit envious as well.
Yes.
They would
Yeah.
like to think, well, why didn't you get it out first? Why is it you were holding on to this like squirrels rather than actually releasing it immediately? But if you want to, and I think this book, and as I said, I have to still read it. What I would find interesting is that the degree and the depth of it is what you get for sacrificing immediacy, if you like. And I think that's the important thing about that.
Yes. We've covered a lot in this edition, and I love it when we can go from one topic to another. And you're so full of vim and vigor about everything we talk about. That's what makes you so interesting, my friend. I have been talking to the one, the only Dr. Binoy Kampmark, Senior Lecturer at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. Binoy, my friend, one of these days, and I think I may have said this to you before, but one of these days we're going to do this in person. But on that note, I should let you know and listeners know that this conversation, as with all my other conversations recently, are now going up on our Life Elsewhere YouTube channel. So you can see us chatter and you can listen to us at the same time. So how do you like that?
Excellent. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Benoit, thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you, Norman. Anytime. Anytime. You take care.